Hi, welcome to Learning English with Pros. This is the channel where we draw on many years of university experience to provide you with reliable information on the English language and handy hints on how to improve your English. Hi, in this video we're going to move from the micro level of noun groups or noun phrases and adjective phrases and so on to the higher levels of text, the intersentential level, looking at sentences as sentence pairs, and the sentence level itself. How do we achieve end focus, end weight? Where do we place adjuncts in English? All of these are to do with information reordering. So how do I reorder information when I translate a text, mainly from German into English, but also the other way around? Where can we place particular adjuncts or adverbials, for instance, in initial position and final position, or both, and so on? These are quite knotty problems sometimes. I'm going to start by looking at the text level, mainly theme-rheme arrangement at the text level. If you want to read up on that, I recommend reading the relevant module 2 in writing in English. Then we're going to look at theme-rheme at the intersentential level and at the issue of splitting sentences. Sometimes you have to split a German sentence into two English sentences, if you like. So split up the German sentence, and that gives you two sentences in English. And finally, we're going to look at the sentence level, mainly, as I was saying, at adjuncts and end focus and end weight. So placing the heaviest element, the longest elements, the elements you want to stress at the end of your English sentence. Now let's have a look at text type as a determinant of translation choices. A typical example here where English and German differ is blurbs. That's Klappentext in German. Now if you compare a typical German and English blurb, you'll find that the author is consistently thematized. There's a consistent string of subjects that always refer to the person in question in English, whereas in German, subjects tend to differ. So, for instance, here's a blurb about Iris Murdoch. Iris Murdoch was born in Dublin in 1919 of Anglo-Irish parents. She went to badminton school Bristol and read classics, implied subject she, at Somerville College, Oxford. During the war, she, same person, was an assistant in subject position, an assistant principal at the Treasury and so on. She held a studentship where she became a fellow of St Anne's College until her death in February 1999. She lived with her husband. Iris Murdoch was made a DBE, and she received the gold pen. So Iris Murdoch is thematized, we might say, consistently in this little blurb. If we look at the blurb about Fritz J. Radatz on the left, we can see that at least the last sentence breaks with this kind of pattern in German. So we have zuletzt erschienen die Tagebücher 2002 bis 2012, where in English we would have to use something like his latest book was, or his latest book is. And if we looked at longer blurbs in German, we'd find more of these sort of deviant constructions if we view it from the perspective of English. So text type determines particular choices in thematization, and one typical example is the blurb. Let's look at another example. Now here we have, this is not a blurb, but a general text, an introduction to a book about Jung in English and a book about Fromm, two psychoanalysts who were quite famous in the 20th century. And if we look at the Fromm text first, perhaps, we find consistent theme in the second sentence. So schreibt Erich Fromm, there's a quote from Erich Fromm first, and then it says, schreibt Erich Fromm. Picks up from again, but then in the next sentence we have a prepositional phrase that picks up from somewhere in the middle of the German sentence. Bei ihm, eine erneuerte Psychoanalyse und marxistische Soziologie bekommen bei ihm ganz eigene Wesenszüge. And we have a fronted object in German. Auch der buddhistische Zugang interessierte ihn. Wen oder was? No, sorry, this is not a fronted object. It's the subject, but from occurs as object here, which would not normally be the case in English probably. And then we have Religion this time starting with a fronted object. Religion begreift er als ein Rahmen der Orientierung. Whereas in the English text about Jung, Jung is consistently thematized again. He was an individualist, he strove, he did, he was willing, he was not unduly perturbed. In his view, it was not his fault. So if we had to translate the German text here into English, we would clearly have to follow this consistent theme-rheme arrangement that is typical of English when we talk about people, for instance, but also when we define things, we would hold the thing to be defined constant. It would appear consistently in subject position, and also when we explain something. Very often we hold the thing to be explained constant in subject position. Now here's a sentence about automobile manufacturing where the adverbial, the adjunct, carries a lot of weight, and this means we have to split up the sentences, the sentence into two parts and render it by means of two separate sentences in German. So let's have a look at this sentence. Testverfahren sollen über das Prüfen der Systemwirkung, that's the adverbial, in bestimmten Situationen, another adverbial. That's usually difficult if you have two adverbials in the same sentence in German. Anreize für den Fahrzeughersteller setzen, Notbremsfunktionen so zu entwickeln, dass der Nutzen im Unfallgeschehen maximiert wird. What this means is if you split it into two sentences, you get Testverfahren sollen die Systemwirkung in bestimmten Situationen prüfen. That's the first important bit of information. And the second important bit is, damit sollen sie Anreize schaffen. So once you've done that, you can easily translate the sentence and give this adverbial, the content contained in the adverbial, the appropriate amount of weight. Test procedures are supposed to test the way a system works in particular situations. And then you pick up procedures again at the beginning of the next sentence. You thematize procedures using appropriate English theme-rheme arrangement, and this gives you the procedures should encourage automakers to develop emergency braking functions in such a way that they're as effective as possible when an accident occurs. Now you can have a stab at the next activity. This is a fairly long German sentence. It looks like a paragraph, it's just one sentence, and of course you'll need to split up the sentence to make it flow, to make the text flow more smoothly in English. I'll just read it out for you. Was in den 30er Jahren vor allem mit Wettbewerb und Monopolkampf und mit Ordnung der Wirtschaft als geschichtliche Aufgabe und rechtsschöpferische Leistung in revolutionär neuer Weise als Gestaltungsaufgabe beschrieben hat, was damals ausführlich diskutiert wurde und was mit der ordoliberalen Prägung der sozialen Marktwirtschaft und der Verabschiedung des Gesetzes gegen Wettbewerbsbeschränkungen die deutsche Wirtschaftsgeschichte in der Nachkriegszeit durchaus beeinflusst hat, traf beim unveränderten Nachdruck von Wettbewerb und Monopolkampf 1964 auf keinen größeren Widerhall mehr und Böhm wurde von einem ausgewiesenen Kenner der seither entwickelten modernen Institutionenökonomik in den 90er Jahren
in einem Überblicksartikel noch nicht einmal als Vorläufer dieser Forschungsrichtung erwähnt, jedenfalls nicht namentlich.
So, this is the solution that John Gallagher came up with. In the 1930s, this is Böhm, who must have been mentioned before, he mapped out the plan for a reform of the economic order. Consistent theme again. His main ideas were set forth in a revolutionary new way in blah, blah, blah. Next sentence starts with these ideas again. Böhm's ideas provoked a lengthy discussion, blah, 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 blah. However, when an unchanged reprint of Wettbewerb im Monopolkampf was brought out in 1964, there was only a lukewarm response from professional economists, and in a recent survey article by recognized authority in modern institutional economics, Böhm is not even mentioned. So Gallagher consistently thematizes Böhm and his work, and this leads to a very smooth flowing English text, a natural sounding English text, which we would not have achieved had we imitated the German sentence as it stands. Let's look at a fairly simple example of reordering, but sometimes people get this wrong. The general difference between German and English in word order at the sentence level is that German starts with any kind of element, which I call the beginning here, and this needs to be followed by the finite verb, and then what follows is the rest of the sentence. In English, of course, we have SV order, subject, verb, usually, and what follows is the rest of the sentence. So a sentence like Gestern ging ich zum Bahnhof must be translated as yesterday I went to the station. That's obvious, no one would get that wrong. Sometimes, of course, we can imitate the German pattern by using inversion in English. Zu den Hauptschwierigkeiten gehören X, Y, and Z, where we give greater prominence to the subject, and also the subject is slightly weightier than the rest of the sentence, X, Y, Z. These might be quite lengthy elements. So here, it would be preferable to use the same order in English and say something like among the major difficulties are X, Y, and Z. If you want to learn more about this, check out Writing in English or Wissenschaftliche Texte auf Englisch schreiben.
Now, as we've just seen, there's a verb second rule in German. We always have to place the verb in second position, and this leads to what we might call brace constructions in German, Klammersatz. So you get constructions like the following. Über diese prinzipiellen Überlegungen hinaus soll im Folgenden vertieft auf bestimmte Risiken der Schaffung europäischer Informations- und Konsultationsgremien eingegangen werden. So we have an adverbial at the beginning of the sentence, followed by the finite verb soll, and then the brace construction, the Klammersatz, starting with an adverb of sequence, im Folgenden, followed by an adverb of degree, and followed by the prepositional object that belongs to the verb eingehen, auf etwas eingehen. So the German brace construction can be extended by adding to the Mittelfeld, that's shown in square brackets. So that's the part of the clause interpolated between the two elements of the verb phrase, between soll and eingegangen. Now, in sharp contrast, English sentences, English clauses, I should say, are normally made longer by inflating what's called the Nachfeld, so by increasing the number of post-verb constituents. So loosely, we might say that English follows a progression from the lower value to the higher valued, from the specific to the general, or from the known to the unknown. So, in other words, English is a language in which the default position of focus is situated towards the end of the clause, and this principle is commonly known as end focus. It was first defined by Quirk and others in 1972. And this is complemented by the principle of end weight, whereby the more complex parts of a clause or sentence occupy end position. It might be added that the focus may fall on a clause constituent which can be separated from the verb by a number of intervening constituents. So it may be verb distant. Typically then, in English, clause constituents are arranged in ascending order of communicative importance, with sequentially increasing prominence, if you like, so that idiomatic renderings of sentence 1 would run as follows. For example, leaving these general considerations, we shall now take an in-depth look at the risks posed by the creation of European information and control agencies. If you want to learn more about this, check out Module 2 in Writing in English or Wissenschaftliche Texte auf Englisch schreiben. I'm now going to give you two examples of thematic arrangement in German that you might find difficult to render into English at first. The first sentence goes something like this. Angestrebt wurde auch die Wiederaufforstung von Gebieten, die durch jahrhundertealte Abholzung verkarstet waren. Now in this sentence, the initial placing of the verb angestrebt wurde, so again we have this typical rule here in German. The verb comes in second position. In front of the verb here we have a participle, which is a little bit unusual perhaps, especially for English readers. And we now have to translate this into proper English, trying to keep the same theme-rheme arrangement if possible. So not starting with reforestation or something like that. So the initial placing of this verb, angestrebt wird, performs a double function. First, it arrests the reader's attention by thematizing the notion of purpose, anstreben, that's pursuing a particular purpose. Secondly, it enables the author to achieve a stylistically well-balanced sentence by applying the end weight principle, which we've just been talking about. And this principle encourages the placing of longer and more complex information units towards the end of the clause. Now, since English verbs rarely occupy front position, it's impossible to replicate this, to replicate the syntactic ordering of the German sentence in English. But we could preserve the theme-rheme pattern by converting the verb anstreben into a noun. So we could use aim or objective or goal or attempt and say something like, attempts were also made to reforest regions eroded by centuries of deforestation, or another of the government's goals was to reforest regions, and so on. Now here's a second example where we have besonders in clause initial position. So the previous sentence, the previous context mentioned some kind of deficiency, erhebliche Menge, and the current sentence says, besonders ausgeprägt und schädlich sind diese Mängel, wenn es darum geht, auf die flagrantesten Verbrechen und Verstöße, die der Schutzverantwortung unterliegen, energisch und rechtzeitig zu reagieren. Now the fronting of the adverbial here, besonders hart, can again be explained by the principle of end weight, and we can preserve the German theme-rheme pattern again by using an inverted construction in this case, where the inversion is triggered by the restrictive adverb nowhere. As you may remember, restrictive adverbs at the beginning of sentences trigger inversion in English, and this permits marked focus to fall on the lengthy adjunct. So we can say something like, nowhere is that gap more pronounced or more damaging than in the realm of forceful and timely response to the most flagrant crimes and violations relating to the responsibility to protect. We now turn to the translation of adjuncts into English, or rather the positioning of adjuncts. Where do you place them in an English sentence? And of course, there are three basic options, which are described in some detail by Hasselgaard, 2010. If you want to check that out, it's a detailed book-length treatment of adjuncts in English. Now, obviously, initial position is favored by those adjuncts that consist of anaphora, or adjuncts that are part of a kind of text strategic chain. So given information in keeping with the theme-rheme principle is usually placed in front position, clause initial position. So sometimes also it's used for backgrounding or cohesion. And adjuncts that place a kind of restriction on the interpretation of the clause message. Medial position is favored by a small set of short adjuncts. So, for instance, you might place something like in 1974 between the auxiliary and the main verb. So, for instance, has or was in 1974 done by someone. That's a very theoretical example, of course. So medial position is favored by short adjuncts, mostly those denoting frequency, time relationship, manner, degree or focus, and end position is favored by time and space. If you have two adjuncts, usually the time adverbial will go to the front of the sentence, the space adverbial will go to the end of the sentence. So end position also contains all those obligatory adjuncts, adjuncts that have what's called predicational scope, that are part of the verb pattern. Now, problems might arise when you have several adjuncts and you need to order them sequentially. Now, the typical order in English was first described by Quirk and others in 1985, and it's as follows: stance. I've added that. Stance and respect adverbs first, followed by process, place, time, and contingency. We're talking about the final zone of the sentence here, talking about end position rather than the initial zone. We'll see what happens in the initial zone in a moment. So a theoretical example that was made up by Quirk and others to demonstrate how this would work theoretically if you had all 5 types of adjunct in one sentence, which would of course be bursting at the seams then, but it's a theoretical illustration of a valid point. So John was working on his hobby, that's respect, and it's also of course dependent on the verb. It's part of the verb pattern, on his hobby, work on something. With the new shears, that's process, more specifically instrument. In the rose garden, that's place. For the whole of his day off, that's time. To complete the season's pruning, that's called contingency in Quirk. Now, interestingly, if we try to translate that into German, we'd find the exact reverse, the reverse order. And we would probably put the contingency adjunct in initial position. So we'd get the following sentence: den diesjährigen Grünschnitt fertigzustellen, that's 5, arbeitete John seinen ganzen freien Tag lang, 4, im Rosengarten, 3, mit der neuen Schere, 2, an seinem Hobby. So this order of adjuncts in the final zone is the exact opposite in German of what it is in English. Another thing we have to remember when positioning adjuncts in the sentence, of course, is that obligatory adjuncts usually go before optional complements. Now, one principle that concerns the final zone, and that you're probably already familiar with, is place before time. So we get sentences like, the actor Lequin travelled to Dijon in 1737, or he studied them carefully that night, or he was born in Munich in 1836. But this type of ordering, this rule, may be overridden by other factors such as end weight, as we can see in the following sentences. The actor Lequin travelled in 1736 to Dijon. Now we get some additional information about Dijon, which allows us to place Dijon after the time element, the time constituent, the time adjunct, where in the course of a week he performed in 7 different tragedies. Same thing with 2a. He studied them that night with a kind of care his wife had suggested. So here we have a much longer phrase, and the principle of end weight kicks in, and we need to reorder the sentence. 3a, very short sentence, but still we add a little bit of information about Munich, namely that Munich is situated in Germany, and then we get the following order. He was born in 1836 in Munich, Germany. Another principle that's quite well known and that contrasts with German is included before including. It doesn't always contrast with German, but occasionally at least, especially if we have 2 time expressions. So, ich treffe dich morgen 3 becomes I'll meet you at 3 o'clock tomorrow, because 3 o'clock is less or is more specific than tomorrow, and it's included in tomorrow. What about this sentence here? Manchmal schläft sie im Familienzimmer, first adjunct, auf dem Boden ein, second adjunct, während der Fernseher noch läuft, third adjunct. Well, in English this would normally be, sometimes she falls asleep on the floor, which is included in the family room, so in the family room is next, and with the television on for company, stays in the same position. Now, in the 1985 Comprehensive Grammar of the English Language, Quirk and others claimed that in the initial zone we have the same kind of order as we've just seen, so place before time and process before time. The examples they give, these are invented examples of course, are as follows. In America, after the election trade began to improve, I think that's perfectly okay though, and slowly during this period people were becoming more prosperous. Also okay, but it's not the commonest order we find in real text. Let's look at a few examples taken from real text. In the next 11 years, time first, as Bavarian Minister of War and Police, he reorganized the army. Now, what we have to remember here is, of course, that in German, we'd have the following order. We'd have in den nächsten 11 Jahren restrukturierte er als bayerischer Minister für Krieg und Polizei. I don't know what time period we're talking about here and what the German term actually is, but we'd have to place Bavarian Minister of War and Police after the verb phrase. So in den nächsten 11 Jahren restrukturierte er als, even after the subject. So if you encounter a German sentence like that, remember that you can put both adjuncts in initial position in English. Another example, in the mid-14th century with Petrarch, so time before another constituent, which might also be described as a temporal constituent though, an awareness arose in Italian humanist circles not only of blah blah blah. Or, in recent years, as part of a comprehensive program review, the Census Bureau sponsored. During the next decade, despite debilitating health problems, Nietzsche managed to author a dozen books. So you can see there's a wide variety of options here to fill this initial zone, starting very commonly
with a time expression. In the next sentence, we have a place adverbial, a place adjunct in initial position. In the Bloomberg survey, in addition to rate cuts, a majority expect the Bank of England to restart asset purchases. So in German, that would give us, in der Bloomberg-Umfrage von Bloomberg, erwartete eine Mehrheit neben X auch Y. So the thematized element, asset purchases, would also be placed at the end of the German sentence, but the element that appears in second position in addition to rate cuts would appear after Mehrheit in the German sentence. At the same time, on the domestic front, again, time before place, contradicting Quirk and others 1985. At the same time, on the domestic front, Brexit has been a key talking point this month. Gleichzeitig war in diesem Monat der Brexit ein wichtiges innenpolitisches Thema. In the morning, on the table beside his empty bed, stood a little opaque blue bottle. Am Morgen stand auf dem Tisch. The fall of the Berlin Wall will forever be a key historical event. In retrospect, because of a confluence of factors, it was a symbol and catalyst of change. Rückblickend in German war es aufgrund. So you can see again, if you encounter a German sentence like this, you can put both adverbials in initial position. In the bathroom with the water running in the sink, he decided to shave as well. At his shoulder, over a foot shorter than he, was a striking Vietnamese woman. Now this is interesting because over a foot shorter than he is a kind of subject complement that modifies the Vietnamese woman, which is a little unusual, but often found in literary texts, of course. To her own surprise, since her monkhood had been intended as atonement rather than whatever, she was happy. So here we have a combination of a stance, adverb expressing emotion, we might say, plus a causal clause, which is also an adjunct, of course. So here are a few additional sentences that will allow you to observe what kinds of elements we can place in initial position, in the initial zone in an English sentence. For bacon, this is an element that has scope over the entire sentence. For bacon, when learning enters into its sexually mature adulthood, so it can be followed by a temporal clause here. After her rape, as the play shifts from its parody of the Aeneid to its tale of Ovidian revenge. So here we have two temporal constituents that follow each other. For example, in the theme-rheme baboon population, after a new male immigrates into the group and achieves top rank, 3 elements. For example, exemplification, in the theme-rheme baboon population, metaphorical place, we might say, and then a temporal clause after a new male immigrates. In addition, connector, additive connector, the child subject, followed by another, so this will be mid position already in a way, but it's still in front of the verb, so that's debatable. No, it's not really mid position, it's still the initial zone. Through its paternity, through its very arrival within or outside marriage, can fulfill a role in placing the mother within society. Now, what do you do in cases where German fronts a very lengthy object, as in this example, taken from a text by Hermann Hesse? Ein gutes Stück von diesem Sommer habe ich verloren, durch schlechtes Wetter, durch Kranksein, durch dies und das. Aber diese Zeit zwischen Sommer und Herbst, die Zeit der letzten heißen Nächte und der ersten Astern, sauge ich mit allen Poren ein. So here we have a very long-fronted object. Diese Zeit zwischen Sommer und Herbst, die Zeit der letzten heißen Nächte und der ersten Astern. We don't normally get this in English. If anything, we get very short-fronted objects in English. So my suggestion would be to insert a new object that summarizes the content of the previous noun phrase, the preceding noun phrase. This time between summer and autumn, when the nights are still warm and the first asters appear, this glorious season I draw in deeply with every breath, or I breathe in with every pore of my body, or I soak up through every pore of my skin. Now here's another illustration of the principle of end weight, and we can also see that German is usually or sometimes point late, even at sentence level, although this term usually applies to text level. And we need to reorder things in English. So, mit einer mittleren Punktzahl von 613 bis 119 Punkten beziehungsweise das Äquivalent von beinahe 3 Schuljahren mehr als der OECD-Durchschnitt erzielte Shanghai, China, die besten Ergebnisse im Bereich Mathematik. Shanghai, China has the highest scores in mathematics, point early, with a mean score of 613 points to 119 points, or the equivalent of nearly 3 years of schooling above the OECD average. So the lengthy element needs to be placed at the end of the English sentence in keeping with the principle of end weight. Now, as you may have noticed, this is a very complex area, and I've only really scratched the surface of it. And to really go deeper here, to learn more about it, you will need to read up on it in books, I'm afraid. I've made a few recommendations here. Well, thank you for watching.